Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. Today we sit down with Greg Bear, and we are very proud to bring you this episode because Greg is such an important author to the genre of science fiction, and he's such a sweet man and just a beloved author all around, so we really hope you enjoy this. We also want to let you know that over the next few weeks, for December, January, we're going to come out with an episode every week with a lot of interviews with authors. We've got David Brin, Elizabeth Bear, Shauna McGuire, Jim Al-Khalili, and Daniel H. Wilson joining us, so please check out those episodes. All right, Greg's waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
Well, we have with us today Greg Bear, an icon of science fiction, I believe, for our generation especially. Greg Bear has written, I think, over 50 books. Is that right?
No, it's more like 37 or 38. Yeah,
37, 38 books. Okay, but he's been a major author on the scene since, I believe, 1983 was when you published Blood Music as a short story. Yeah, before it became a novella. And we, as the book club, before we started recording the podcast, Blood Music was one of the first books we all read together and discussed together. We love that book. It's also, I see from Wikipedia, attributed as one of the first science fiction or the first science fiction account of nanotechnology. In a very complex biological way. So we've been reading a lot of kind of biological sci-fi. So we definitely want to talk to you about that. Greg Bear he's won multiple Hugo and Nebula Awards. Nebula for Best Book in 1993 for Moving Mars, and then 1999 for Darwin's Radio, which was followed by a sequel, Darwin's Children. And he's also written on these three books are really interesting to us, and I think we want to focus on this theme of accelerated evolution, and also they take place, or part of the story is in a pandemic. So we'd certainly like to talk to you about your reaction to the last couple of years of living under pandemic circumstances. So welcome, Greg Bear. We're really happy to talk to you.
Good to talk to you guys.
So why don't we start things off with a really difficult question. Greg, tell us about some of the shows you've been watching lately. Is there any good sci-fi that you recommend? Any contemporary stuff? Maybe if you've got a Netflix subscription, or what's something that you've been watching that you'd like to share with others?
Well, you know that I'm old enough that back in my youth there were only 2 or 3 science fiction shows, other than the anthology shows, which I greatly enjoyed. But nowadays, there's dozens, and there's so many choices to make. And what we've been watching include Foundation, which I'm quite pleased with, and Expanse, which is also one of the best science fiction shows of all time. We watched Tales from the Loop, which is quite an amazing show. It's very much kind of a neo-technical Ray Bradbury type story, but with no resolution. And this is what we find interesting about many science fiction shows today, is they set up the trap, but there is no resolution. You never figure out why the trap exists, who's trapping us, and all that kind of stuff. And that's true of The Loop as well. Go back to when Lost came out. We never found out what really happened on Lost. We were kind of told by the showrunners that they knew exactly what was going on. They did, but it wasn't a very satisfactory answer. So, it allowed them to do anything they wanted to do, which I guess is kind of ideal for a showrunner, especially if the show succeeds. But we've been watching a lot of these shows, and now we're going back, and we watched last night the 1931 Dracula in the 4K version. And, a lot of these films have been remastered in such a way that it's as if you've never seen them before. So old and new, we've been keeping up on a lot of different areas, including fantasy, horror, that kind of stuff. I've always enjoyed these areas.
Interesting.
So were you big into Lost when that came out and watching that every week, Greg?
Yeah, we did. We had our kids at home, Alex anyway, and we watched that. And when we got the first HD TV, we suddenly realized, wait a minute, you can read the writing on the wall there,
Oh, yeah.
And so we kind of expanded our understanding of that sort of thing. But I've watched Lost a couple of times now, and I think it's quite a marvelous TV show as a TV show. As an experiment in philosophy, it's not all that satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It kind of did kickstart a lot of good science fiction television. Battlestar Galactica just before it as well, but that was kind of the early 2000s where we really kickstarted these great shows.
Right. And Battlestar Galactica is quite an amazing show as well, the remake. The first one is quite revolutionary in the fact that it brought movie special effects to television. And that was, really interesting. But the second one is actually extremely well done.
Mm-hmm. I love that series. I love it. Whenever somebody asks me, is Star Trek or Star Wars, I say Battlestar Galactica.
How about Babylon 5?
Haven't gone there yet.
Even better. Yeah.
That's another obsession, right?
Yeah.
My brother is a huge fan of Babylon 5. He's recommended it to me since the 90s, and I've just never gone there. But he said he's a big Trekkie, and he says, I think it's a little better than Trek. So one day.
Some people certainly say so.
Well, there was just a list published that I saw yesterday of the top 100 TV series of the 21st century. And The Wire is number one, of course. But the only science fiction on there was actually the top-rated science fiction show was Battlestar Galactica. And it was at number 70, so still pretty far down.
Yeah, that list is not reliable, I don't think so.
No.
I guess if you count Lost, that's certainly, as science fiction, it ranked higher. Yeah. Well, I would like to talk to you a little more about Foundation since you mentioned it. So you've written one of the second Foundation trilogy,
right?
Which was a different author for each of the three books, which is a really interesting idea. I've never seen anywhere else. Gregory Benford wrote the first one. You wrote the second one, and David Brin wrote the third one. And I believe Foundation and Chaos, the one you wrote, that happens right in the very opening sort of scene, isn't it? Or right after the very first third of the original Foundation book.
Right.
So yeah, I'd love to hear more about your reaction to the TV series. How do you feel about how it's made? What do you think?
Well, it's beautiful. It's beautifully made, and the special effects are astonishing. I've done work with Skydance over the years, and I think this is probably their best production so far. The interesting thing about this show is how much it's different from Isaac's Foundation and yet the same. It has a very Asimovian feel, but they had to, or at least they wanted to, transform a lot of the characters. So a lot of the characters who were male in the book are female here. And of course, there is no ethnicity ascribed in the book. The names are kind of generic or odd. And so that is perfectly understandable and believable. And I think they've actually created a modern epic, which is pretty good. And in terms of science fiction ideas, they've captured a lot of Asimov's thoughts. And there's some good performances in there, too. So I'm quite pleased with the whole result. And, when we wrote our book, we weren't really up for changing everything so drastically. Certainly reversing characters and stuff, but I was allowed to do a few things like bring in the robots as Asimov did in the later series, and do variations on their workings and how long they stuck around and that sort of stuff, and that was fun. Actually, Isaac transformed the Foundation universe himself. And by bringing in the robot universe and integrating those, he gave the inspiration for David Brin, who brought in every other Asimov novel and integrated it in his book and kind of sealed it all off. And I think what we're doing with the TV series is keeping Asimov alive, keeping his ideas and his thoughts alive, and as we tried to do with the second Foundation trilogy.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Well, that's fantastic. It certainly is. Yeah, it does seem like it's sort of a container. It's the Foundation universe that they've sort of created, and then they're going to write in, a lot of other things. Well, and I don't know if you noticed this, but in the first episode, there's the most dramatic scene is I believe straight out of Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, the explosion, the terrorist attack on the space elevator.
Right.
I mean, I've been waiting to see that scene on the big screen for 20 years, ever since I read Red Mars. I was like, this needs to be made into a movie. I want to see that space elevator fall. And
I don't think they gave Stan credit for it, though.
I don't think. Well,
there were a lot of space elevator stories. Charles Sheffield, a number of other folks created space elevator stories back in the 90s. Yeah. And when Stan did it, it was pretty established, what would happen. So I've never written a space elevator story. I was working with a Microsoft team to help create a game that might have had a space elevator in it, but that never came to pass. So thinking about it is one thing we do, but writing about it is something else.
Do you think we'll ever build a space elevator? Will we ever have the materials to pull
well,
it off?
We know a lot of people up here in Seattle who worked on space elevator materials, including Robert Forward, who had designed a weave that allowed you to use monomolecular filament to do a space elevator type suspension. And I suspect that's what was going on in Foundation, but they never got into that much detail. It looked a lot more cluttered than we would have seen in a Robert Forward space elevator or a Charles Sheffield story or any of those folks. But it was still effective.
Interesting.
And because it fell apart so drastically and killed so many people, I'm not sure politically it was a good move. And also, you could destroy a space elevator so easily with a few bombs here and there. I'm not sure that's a strong position to take on technology.
Right.
You mentioned that you were working on video game with Microsoft, and you've done other video game work. Can you talk a little bit about how that fits in as a sci-fi author? What's your general role with that?
Well, I'm very pleased to do it because these guys are actually involved in some of the biggest show business spectacles of our time. We think of the games at Microsoft. I actually pitched this as a possibility back in the early 90s, where I wanted to have the West Coast, the Northwest Coast, become basically the new Hollywood. And I thought Microsoft might be a good place to start that, but some of the powers that be decided against that. So when things like Xbox came around, and then the Halo series came around and moved over from Bungie to Microsoft, that was a fascinating time period. And I was allowed to work on that for the books, but I was also given complete freedom to help create the understory, the backstory for the Halo series, based on a few things they knew about it. And when they gave me that freedom, that was an amazing experience. And it was also, they took a lot of risk because a lot of the fans of Halo really kind of reserved that history for themselves. They wanted to explore it themselves. But when I wrote the books, to my astonishment, and I think Microsoft's astonishment, the Halo fans just grabbed it up and ran with it. It became canonical. It became part of their expositions on the game. And they asked a lot of questions, key questions. And I thought that was very heartening. It was really nice to feel that kind of approval, because these guys really were science fiction fans. And, so Halo is a science fiction series. And quite often I will get asked by Halo fans, how did you do this? How did you think up all this stuff? And I says, I've been reading science fiction my entire life. Fits right in.
Was there any collaboration with Peter Jackson or talk about that when he was trying to make a film out of that? Was that? No, we kind of, I think, interacted with Peter Jackson more on King Kong later on, when the museum we were working for helped barter the exchange of Ray Harryhausen's or of Willis O'Brien's dinosaur armatures, which he used to make a short spider pit sequence, which they put on the Kong disc when it came out. That was fun, and I've always appreciated Peter Jackson, but no, we didn't have any connection there with the Halo.
With Halo, no, because that was all done by the time I came on board.
Right.
Have you ever seen this TV show called Mythic Quest?
No.
It's about a software company that makes, video games, and there's a Nebula winning author that works there and writes material, and it's actually quite funny. And the
That's
last
probably Ted Chiang, if I think about it.
Oh yeah,
the fact that he's more likely to be the source, because he actually works at Microsoft, and of course has a movie out now, The Arrival, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Oh, I love Ted Chiang. Yeah, we've talked about him a fair bit. It's one of my favorite stories ever. Is the story of your life. That's an incredible story that they based Arrival on.
Yeah.
Well, that takes us over to, speaking of Arrival, to Dune. Are you going to go see that in the theater? Is that something you want to see?
I think we might go see it in the theater. We actually snuck out and saw a couple of movies in the interim when COVID was not quite over to the worst part. But I'm certainly looking forward to seeing Dune. And I'm a big fan of the 84 Dune, which I saw in the theater back in 84. And, it was, I think, one of the hardest things that David Lynch ever did. And he really got burned by that. But it's a fantastic film. It's, texturally, visually, it's very much as if the Russians had made a Dune story. It's like Tarkovsky doing Dune. And I think if Tarkovsky had made it, it would be much more popular today.
Right. Jodorowsky was supposed to make it too, right?
That was an interesting. A lot of the stuff from Jodorowsky came over to Aliens later on. Yeah. Alien and so on. A lot of the characters and the actors, and Dan O'Bannon, of course, becomes major in Alien soon.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Well,
let me switch from TV to books, since we do have a book specialist among you. We're just curious, who are you reading these days? Who do you take on vacation with you in the summer? Who are you most? What kind of sci-fi do you read, and who's your favorite?
I don't read a lot of sci-fi, and haven't for years. I've dipped in to do voting and that sort of stuff, but what I'm reading right now is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Going back and just rereading it, and I haven't read it for 40 years at least, maybe more. And it's an astonishing book. It's very, very advanced thought for the day. But I did notice in one of the design things, I'm a big fan of Harper Goff's Nautilus in the Disney version of 20,000 Leagues. But it's a very different ship than what Verne is describing in the novel. And I think the romantic version sticks in people's minds. But Verne was very practical about his submarine.
Interesting. Any other classics then that you've been revisiting like that?
Not so much. I read a lot of history and that sort of thing, and read a lot of Joseph Conrad, and one of my favorite writers is Nikos Kazantzakis, and I get back to him occasionally, and just a lot of different books. But I try to keep up with short stories whenever I can. My wife certainly keeps up with it more than I do. We know a fair number of writers up here who work with the Clarion West Workshop, and sometimes brought over to help teach. But we haven't had that for a year and a half now, and that we really miss. We really miss the interaction with the future writers who would be coming along. And so, in a sense, I haven't been spurred to read much stuff in recent memory.
Right. Since we're talking about books and current projects, I know you've published a new book very recently called The Unfinished Land. I believe it's a sort of young adult, right? Sort of genre, and
the main character is 15 or 16, but I wouldn't call it young adult, because it's really a kind of very difficult to describe this book, because it is about the origins of stories. It's about where history and story making comes from, fable, myth, all that stuff. And it turns out that some very strange creatures came down from the space, and they helped shape our reality. But they didn't have language. So some of the travelers who crossed the continents from South India, bringing language with them, actually gave these creatures language, and that was what kickstarted human history. So that's part of the story, but of course it's all from the point of view of a 16-year-old who's not at all sure who or why he's here. But he's in an island at the top of the world, a ring of islands, the Blessed Isles, which each one is endowed with the ability to help write the history of different parts of the earth.
Interesting. I've been listening to it on audio, but I haven't quite finished yet. And it is a very complex and interesting story. I like this idea that there are these sort of, I guess, the fae folk, the fairy folk, sort of from Celtic or lore that kind of live, I think, in this unfinished land. But they export themselves. They go to the human lands, and then they come back after a while to sort of report on what's going on there.
Well, the humans are assigned to do that. The various elven types, godlike types, are kind of, they stick around on this place. But the humans, one of our characters in particular, Manuel, is sent out to do that. He's basically acting as a Spanish sailor, and he goes out for 60 years or more. And then when he comes back, certain of the powers that be on this island give him time back. These reverse vampires actually are not sucking blood. They are taking time away from human beings, and then give it back to him so that he can go out and voyage again and report back to what's changing in the outside world based on what the crafters, these strange beasts that are creating history, are doing. And when they change things, the world in the island doesn't really know what's going on, so they send sailors out to figure that out.
Oh, interesting. Great. Yeah, it's a neat story. So maybe we can just let's talk about Blood Music and Darwin's Radio a little bit. I mean, these are really sort of monumental works in the history of sci-fi right now. Since Blood Music is, credited with being the first account of nanotechnology, and you're a hard sci-fi author, so you've always studied very closely the real science that goes into your books. I wanted to ask you, in your lifetime, what have you seen, and how have you, seen nanotechnology change? Since your first imaginings of this sort of thing, to it always seems, we're told that the biotechnology revolution is just around the corner, and the nanotechnology revolution is just around the corner, and
like fusion.
I'm not sure
right?
it's like fusion. It's 20 years away, and it always will be.
Or quantum computing, which is our current obsession. My current obsession, certainly.
Right. Yeah. Well, you got right into the sort of computing aspects of nanotechnology right there at the DNA level in Blood Music, which was incredibly forward thinking. So yeah, maybe you could just talk a little bit about what you've seen in the development of nanotechnology in your lifetime and your reaction to that.
Well, I was pleased to meet Richard Feynman in the 1970s, and kind of followed his career. And he invented quantum computing, or thought about it early on. He invented nanotechnology, or thought about it. And my first concept, as I was thinking about nanotechnology, was, well, we already have it. It's called biological molecules. There are micro machines, and they're doing proteins are doing amazing work throughout our body every single time. Sometimes at 60 cycles per second, or 60,000 cycles per second. And so that's what's powering us. So if we have nanotechnology already, then it's going to be biologically based before it's become silicon based. But for some reason, the people who preferred silicon kind of took the idea forward in books like Engines of Creation and that sort of stuff. And they were quite remarkable in terms of their positing the idea. But I thought to myself, we already have this. We are nanotechnology. And it also occurred to me that, a DNA molecule was, in a sense, both a map and a computational system for helping create other cells, other beings, etc. And it's all kind of nested together. And then the way it interconnects in its development, or in our development, is fascinating. And I thought, that's a computational system. It's certainly a thought-based system. I'm not sure that thought and computation are the same thing, though. What we have in our brain is not what computers do.
Well, we haven't seen, everybody's been worrying and scared, especially since, the new vaccines are out. People found out that they were carried by nanoparticles. This caused a lot of
every vaccine is carried by nanoparticles. Come on. I think it's fear of needles that propels resistance to the vaccines. A lot of people, or at least a fair number of people, 5 or 10%, just don't like needles at all. Right. I think back to one of my favorites, Rachel Maddow, who got the one jab, Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because she didn't like the idea of a second jab. Well, my wife and I both got 2 jabs, and I, as a kid, I was a Navy brat, and so I was used to, not that I approved of it all the time, but I was used to getting shots before we went overseas on my father's tours. And, the last time I got a smallpox vaccination was probably back in the 1960s, early 70s. And, that was all experimental back in the day, but also the flu vaccines, all this sort of stuff. All vaccinations are experimental in a real sense. Mm-hmm. And you're never going to have 100% perfect response. Mm-hmm. But on this one, we haven't gotten COVID yet, and we've had the Pfizer and the Moderna. We're looking forward to the 3rd jab. And, this poor coach who just got fired, he's trying to sue to get his job back. Come on, man. You had a multi-million-dollar a year job for what you loved, and you weren't willing to get a jab with a needle? Yeah. That's fear.
Yeah.
That's deep fear.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of fear created by, intentionally. I mean, it's propagandized fear at this point, right? Like
absolutely, which is unbelievable to me that we have a political party that is now trying everything it can to destroy the Americans. Mm-hmm. I wonder sometimes if, in fact, they're being paid by Russia to kill as many Americans as possible. I think Fox News may be. If you think about how Fox News has propelled this thing forward with their own opinionators, and I think they're paid by the Russians to kill Americans. It makes perfect sense to me.
Well,
if they want to sue me, I will talk to them later.
Well, we try to be polite Canadians and not quite put our foot in in American politics too much, but it does seem like a bit of a disaster down there, looking from the outside. I think it's really interesting what you said about never being perfect, because I had a heart attack a few years ago. Uh-huh. I went to the hospital. They did an amazing job taking care of me. I felt, great hands. I'm a happy taxpayer for the rest of my life. They had all this technology, drugs, medicine, and guess what? Somebody was first to do the surgery I had.
That's
Somebody
right.
was first to take the drugs I was on. Somebody was first for all the medical advances that we live with quite happily and benefit from. And with vaccines, it's always going to be somebody's got to be first, and it's a well-established research environment, and that they clinical data and all these things are very well done. But am I willing to be the first 1 million people to take a drug? Yeah, and it might have a tiny little risk to me, but it's sort of I think we all,
especially when the alternative is dying, right? So.
Exactly. Yeah, we have the responsibility to pass it forward, right? The way it has been passed forward to us, that there's always going to be some risk, and it does seem to be small. I mean, geez, we've vaccinated 6.5 billion people now.
Yeah.
It's pretty okay.
I think it's fear of needles. It's not fear of anything else rational, and they just don't like needles. I wonder how they've survived to adulthood so far. I had an experience about 7 years ago where I had what's called an aortic dissection, which is invariably fatal. Basically, your aorta splits and divides, and suddenly you aren't able to get blood to the brain, and it kills you very quickly. Well, I recognized it at about 12 noon. My wife came over to take a look at me. She called the emergency medical team, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, after they drove me to a hospital that could do this, they had me sedated, connected to heart-lung machine, split open at the chest, and they put in a new aorta and a titanium valve. And I wasn't there. My lungs were, and they complained mightily thereafter for being pushed aside in this open heart surgery. But I'd never heard of aortic dissection before, and suddenly there I was, and I survived, and I was able to get so far 4 more books out of my life, and the rest of my family here was able to keep me around for a while. That was not experimental at the time we were doing it, but it was almost experimental. It was a very dangerous procedure, and it involved extraordinary expertise from a surgical team in Seattle area, of which probably only 1 or 2 teams in Seattle could do this sort of thing. And we got to see some of the CAT scans and things like that of my body before this. And I look at that image, 3-dimensional up and down, and I realize this is a dead man. Until they fixed me up and put in, these robot parts, I was a dead man. I could not survive this. And in fact, most of the emergency medical people that I've spoken to in emergency wards and so on have a graveyard of people who didn't survive. And many of them are aortic dissection victims. Mm-hmm. And so I've been talking with the John Ritter Foundation. He died of an aortic dissection. And apparently the one thing I did right was I recognized this is not a heart attack, but it hurts and it's not good. And I told that to everyone who treated me. And at one point, a doctor says, this is probably an aortic dissection. This is serious. Call your family. Mm-hmm. Make sure everyone knows about this. Well, I got through it. Mm-hmm. And, within a couple of months, I was riding a bicycle until I realized at some point, you're on such a high level of blood thinners, you probably don't want to be riding a bike around. So you have to take compromises with medicine, but it's better than being dead. And this whole vaccine thing reminds me of when I was a kid. I actually kind of had a fit one time in a doctor's office before we got our shots for going to, I think it was Japan. And they gave me the shots anyway, because you had to, if you're going to travel, you have to have these shots. And eventually I got used to them. But every time we took a trip to, say, Kodiak or the Philippines or, anywhere, you had to have these shots. And so I'm pretty used to it by now. Mm-hmm. Plus the blood draw, I get a blood draw at least once a month. And so that's another needle. I guess, if you haven't had needles in your life, you may be afraid of them. I can't really be afraid of them.
We are blessed to live in the time that we do. The health outcomes of people that live today are astoundingly higher than at any other time. It's
That's
just, right. It's not only the fear of needles, but people also have this challenge with probabilistic reasoning. We hear about some negative outcomes from vaccinations, and people fixate on that. And it's hard for them to kind of understand that that's a small percentage, and that the positive healthcare outcomes are kind of in the middle of that normal curve. And it's a challenge for thinking about gray areas.
Yeah, but it has been ever since, and I think there's just always been a substantial portion, maybe less than 10%, but of the population that just really don't want to have extreme medical intervention. Mm-hmm. And I can understand that to some extent, but I benefited from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In your novel, Darwin's Radio, I should set it up a little bit so that there's a new virus. It turns out it's a retrovirus, human endogenous retrovirus. So this is basically a virus that transcribes its RNA into DNA and then inserts that DNA into human cells. And the premise of the book is that this is actually, that there is some trigger for accelerated evolution. And this virus is sort of shuffling human DNA and very quickly over a short period of time, and basically creating a new species of human. And so it's treated, it's a very intense book, politically charged. I mean, from the 90s, talking about the government coming down with a heavy-handed, especially the U.S. government, right, getting involved in abortion, aborting, mutated babies. So it was a really intense sort of, spectacular social situation you set up. But there are these scenes of protests outside of hospitals in that book. And of course, reading that from however long, it's been 22 years, I guess, since you wrote that book. And I can just imagine what you might think today, seeing the kinds of protests. Could you ever imagine that people would be protesting the use of medicine in the first place at a hospital, rather than protesting government heavy-handed, whatever the protests were in that book?
Yeah, well, in Darwin's Radio, the reason they're protesting is because it involves birth,
right?
And children and all that stuff. And it turns out in Darwin's Children that it's actually a program to avoid evolution if you can avoid it. And so we can't avoid evolution. But my whole thinking here began about 7 years before I wrote the book, where I really was bearing down hard on biological learning and trying to get up to date on what I thought was going on, because we were coming up on the Human Genome Project. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was going to be pretty fascinating. What were we going to learn? Well, what we were going to learn is we didn't know a lot before. We didn't understand how many genes actually existed. I didn't actually understand how genes were separated and not just linear in the genome, that you had genes and different chromosomes, you had all these things interacting through the various molecular machinery that uses genetics and helps encode the genetics that keeps us developing as babies, but also that helps us stay alive. And that whole interplex of processes and procedures absolutely fascinated me. And then I asked myself, okay, I know about bacteria having viruses that help them transfer genes, kind of FedEx for genes. What about us? What do we have? And I says, well, I can invent something. And so I invented what I thought would be interesting, and then realized, wait a minute, no, here it is. I read in a textbook. Human endogenous retroviruses are actually transferred, but they're not infectious when they're created. Mm-hmm. But when women give birth, they create a flood of human endogenous retroviruses in the bloodstream, which seem to be used, according to Louis P. Villarreal at UCI, that seem to be used for providing a way for the baby not to trigger the immune response. And I thought, wait a minute, this kind of explains HIV too. This human endogenous, or this virus that tamps down your immune system and triggers it and so on. So where did this come from? And my thought was, okay, bushmeat could have come from a pregnant chimpanzee or some other pregnant, simian. In them, it was the protection against the baby being aborted because of immune system. In us, it's a deadly disease. Mm-hmm. And so let's stay away from bushmeat if we can possibly do so. But it was too late because it had already invaded our society and was on its own way. And the whole thing was both positive and negative. It was astonishing. Okay, this is how we get born. We get born by creating these retroviruses, particles, which are not infectious. They cannot pass easily from one person to another, but they do in the pregnant woman help us get born. But the bad side is that if you mix and match different species, you can get this immune system disaster area. And at that point, I says, oh my gosh, this is the book. We've got a system of FedEx for genes, very much in some respects like what you see in bacteria. And some of these things, these viruses that affect bacteria, are beneficial to the bacteria, and some are deadly to the bacteria. And back in the 20s, the Eliava Institute in Georgia, Republic of Georgia, actually tried to use these bacteriophages that were bad for bacteria to treat wound victims and that sort of thing. And that was a really interesting period of time. And in Russia, it continued into World War II. They would carry vials of these Eliava-phage and try to kill off the bad bacteria that were infecting wounds. That didn't actually work out in our world. It did in Russia, but that was fascinating. So that's why I established part of the story is taking place in Georgia, just for that purpose.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I do want to talk about a little more science, especially in Darwin's Radio. You took such a deep dive both into molecular biology and genetics in that book, but especially around the theory of evolution, punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. And in 2003, when you published Children of Darwin's Children, there's this great update. You have something called caveats at the back of the book where you speculate on certain things, and you give a great reading list about the proponents of gradualism like Dawkins versus punctuated equilibrium like Stephen Jay Gould. Now, I'm not a evolutionary biologist, so I haven't kept up with it as much as I think you have. And I was wondering if, is punctuated equilibrium still a thing? Is there still a controversy? Has this been resolved? Do people know how speciation occurs today in a way that we didn't know 20 years ago?
Not to my knowledge. I think that evolutionary theorizing is certainly locked in a conservative cycle now, has been since the Dobzhansky modern synthesis in the 1920s. Dawkins is not just a gradual person. He's also a random person. He believes most of these changes are random. I can't believe that at all. There's too much going on. There's too many choices to be made for it to be random, because, if you have, 60,000 changes per month in your DNA, it can't be random. So if you are saving yourself by going through DNA processes that are unknown to us in many instances, but known in some, how can that be random? Randomness does not generate positive outcomes usually. We don't put ourselves in the hands of a random doctor. We try to figure out what's going on, and I think nature is much the same way. But what we do see is there are some instances in evolution, and they have been known for generations now, where organisms go through changes that are not random at all, but are dictated by what I didn't talk about in the Darwin's books, which was the overlayer of evolutionary direction, the DNA that controls whether genes are activated or not. And going into that, that's actually a major thing for evolutionary change. For example, one of my favorite creatures we've seen in our lake often is the water flea, the Daphnia. And the Daphnia are often preyed upon by what are known as phantom midgefly larvae, which are really monstrous looking creatures. They're kind of like vampire collies, but miniature, only about half an inch long. But they go after the water fleas. And when they occupy the same water volume as the water fleas acquire a heavier armor. They look quite different as water fleas. Someone back in 1908 might have said, "Oh, this is a new species." No, but what they do is they wear that armor for a while as long as there are threats, and then they shed it because it's so expensive to process, to create. And when the threat goes away, they shed it. Now that process is not random. That's a regular thing. Sometimes you have insects, stick insects, that develop wings, and then in 2 or 3 generations, they lose the wings. They don't need them anymore. That's not random. What if evolution is a more elaborate and interesting version of that? Where are the secret masters of evolution in our genome? We haven't figured that out. And I think we haven't figured it out because mostly evolutionary theory is held up by the Domshansky types. And they really do occupy, at the older level, the chairs of academic education. And so that's where we're kind of hung up now on still trying to figure out what Darwin didn't quite figure out back in the day. And Dobzhansky thought he'd figured it out. Well, he didn't. And, we still have no idea how evolution really works. So we can write science fiction about it and get away with it. Although some people criticize me, not a lot, which was interesting. Also, I tend to stay in the area of the botanists and the virologists. They are very, very open to changes in evolutionary theory because they see it all the time. Mm-hmm. Botany is an extraordinarily different procedure in evolution. You have these virions, you have viroids, you have all these different processes that help affect things like fruiting behavior in trees and so on. And that indicates to me, okay, what are we dealing with here? Is this all randomly triggered? No, because it happens every season,
So do you have an idea of what it would take to disprove the randomness? If you had a guess of what we would see to disprove this?
I think what we would see is there is a kind of judgmental system, a creationist system, not creationist, but a system that allows new species to slowly develop and then triggers them. I don't know if that would be what I describe in Darwin's Radio or not, but we've never seen a speciation event in large-scale animals. We see it all the time in bacteria, we see it in viruses, we see it in plants, but we do not see it in creatures like us. And so that's, A, it's a kind of a puzzle, but I'd like to know more. And B, I think if we looked into it deeply without the constraints of the academic conservatives in our society, that we would be able to see this. But what they do is they're desperately afraid of what happened to Darwin, which is, the religious, what people would come in and say, you're a monster. You know, God is in charge of all of this. Well, I think God kind of subdivides his rights and his rule here to the biological creatures he's created. And part of our system of DNA and of interaction allows for change. And certainly we've seen it, but actually we're kind of a monoculture now in terms of human physiology compared to what we were 800,000 years ago. There were many species of humans or human-like at that point, and they interacted, and they might have interbred. And that's becoming more and more interesting, is that whole thought pattern of what it was like to be a human being or a near human being 1 million years ago is an amazing process to think about. We've learned recently something that was not allowed when I was doing Darwin's Radio, which is that we have Neanderthal genes. White people, certainly. People came out of Europe have Neanderthal genes. Now, I actually haven't kept up on how this is known, but I accept it. I think it's an interesting theory. And so when I was writing the Halo books, I had a lot of human species interacting. And one of the most prominent was one of my favorites of the recent ones, which was a very small hominid from the Flores Islands in Indonesia called the Floresiensis. And he was only like 3.5 feet tall, but he was a powerhouse in the novels. And he runs the society of the villages that are on Earth in this book. And he became one of the favorite characters of the Halo fans because he was 3.5 feet tall and very feisty. And I thought that made perfect sense to me. You know, just because you're small doesn't mean you can be weak. And these guys carried tools around and hunted phantom elephants, or not phantom, but small elephants and small rhinoceroses and all sorts of creatures back then. They must have been very fierce.
I've often thought that
we didn't think that such creatures could exist, but now we call them hobbits, and now we almost accept them.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I've often thought that, you know, that this sort of mythology that we have of hobbits, elves, ogres, dwarves, these kinds of things, it might be some form of racial memory, right? Biological sort of subconscious that we remember our hominid ancestry somehow, that when we were different types of hominids that seemed to be a lot like hobbits or elves, or, you know, and Cro-Magnon and Neanderthals, they had very different characteristics.
They did, but you know, the Cro-Magnon is Homo sapiens.
It's Homo sapiens. That's right.
Neanderthals are so close that I'm sure interbreeding occurred. Apparently, it did occur because we've got the genes to prove it. But if you go back to that time period, there's just a lot of interaction between different creatures and animals and everything that I find fascinating, and it's part of the ecological system and the story of human evolution is very complex and not simple. And it's not just one species forever and ever. That's kind of a racist attitude, which somehow sticks around in Dobzhansky. You know, we've got superior, which is Cro-Magnon, and we have inferior, which is Neanderthal. But the Neanderthal brain case was slightly larger than the Cro-Magnon brain case. You know, how's that explained? Well, on the other hand, we have these creatures like crows and so on that are very intelligent, but don't have huge brains. And how do you explain that? And so I suspect brain size is not the major issue here.
I've heard recently that they've just discovered, surprisingly this late, that the crow brain is actually just a lot more dense. They actually pack a whole lot more neurons per volume into those brains. And I saw what you were just saying in Nature. It was just came out last month that they have a number now for how much Neanderthal DNA we have in us, and it's 20%. 20% in genetics is enormous. I mean, that must have been nothing but interbreeding, basically, to get that much of another species.
Which means that Neanderthal females and males must have been very attractive.
Interesting. Yeah. And it also explains maybe some of the complexity that we live with today, right? In terms of we're a very conflicted species. We have very strange sort of sexual past and history and mores. And maybe it's because we're kind of this combination of two pretty different beings. And
we're more like the bonobos than we would like to think. The bonobos have a very interesting sexuality to them. And actually, we've seen them occur in silent films. I believe Thief of Baghdad has a bonobo chimpanzee from 1920s. And I'm fascinated by the fact that they kind of walk like us, they kind of look like us, and they certainly have sexuality like us. So really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to follow up on what we've been talking about here with a quote from actually, I think this is from the back of Darwin's Children, from this caveats page that you wrote here. In answer to the obvious questions about evolution, do I support neo-Darwinian randomness or theistic external design? The answer must be neither. Do I support fundamentalist or creationist views of our origins? I do not. My view is that life on Earth is constituted of many layers of neural networks, all interacting to solve problems in order to get access to resources and continue to exist. All living things solve problems posed by their environments, and all are adapted to attempt, with reasonable success, to solve such problems. The human mind is just one variety of this natural process, and not necessarily the most subtle or sophisticated. I love that. That's the most intelligent thing I've read in years. That's amazing. It is, I think, a very sophisticated view of probably the next chapter, of biology, when we will have to deal with thinking of things exactly as you say, as networks, right? We're a genomic network. We're also a neural network. There's all these overlapping networks, like you say, across different scales. And yeah, I think it's a very difficult problem to think about, but I think you've hit it on the head. That the genomic network is something like a mind, maybe not like a personality or self-aware mind, but it is a problem-solving network. Do you have anything more you wanted to add to that? I mean, I think that's a wonderful progressive view.
We are heading into, if we get this quantum computing idea to be a little more solid, although they've got some interesting design developments so far that are moving on at Microsoft and other places, many other places. That will allow you to do in multiple universes what many computers haven't been able to do in one, which is to solve huge, intractable problems across many alternate universes and then pull out the answer later on. And writing about this, there's a textbook coming out pretty shortly on quantum computing, which I wrote a new introduction for. I wonder how much of what who was it who was thinking about the extension of physics in the human mind. It was I'm going to
the mitochondria. He won a Nobel Prize recently. The Emperor's
not just mitochondria, but just the whole notion of the neurons accessing basically kind of quantum computing states. I'm not sure that's strictly necessary, but it is interesting, and we can solve many, many problems with these kind of computers. But I'm wondering, and I'm suddenly kind of becoming more open to the possibility, I'm wondering how much the mind is a kind of quantum computing system. And what it's, in its intricacy, have we found those connections with access to the alternate universes? Because if we have, I'm going to get a lot weirder in my thinking.
Is it maybe Roger Penrose you're thinking of?
Yeah, Penrose, I'm thinking
the quantum mind.
Yeah, the quantum mind, and Penrose was. I didn't think that was strictly necessary, but I've had experiences since, which tell me that our whole view of this universe is incomplete. And in fact, that some of the things that we consider to be superstition or spiritualism or whatever may in fact not just be real, but be extremely important. And if that is the case, thank God I'm not a scientist, because I get fired right away. I'd be drummed out of the department if I were doing this. But I've had these experiences over the years involving seeing what people would call ghosts and so on, which I didn't ask for. And I, didn't know quite what to make of them. But they happened. And so as I'm trying to figure them out, I can't figure out the physics of how this works or anything else or what the ultimate outcome would be. I am an unwitting witness to these things, unwilling in some cases. And I can't answer those questions. So if there are unanswered questions out there, that leaves a lot of space for thinking about things, for being a writer, for trying to figure out what being a human being means, for being what it means when you end being a human being. You know, if you're a quantum observer, if you're helping flip the state on reality by staring at it as we would have in some of these systems, if you are determining what is real and what is not, what happens when you die? Does that stop? If it does, how does it stop? How long can it continue? I'm old enough that I've been through enough crap that it's kind of time to start thinking in the long term over what's happening next. And I don't know.
Maybe
I don't think
it's fascinating.
It's a mystery, and it's going to be an adventure, you know?
Well, maybe the universe conspires to make sure you don't stop observing, and this is the basis of the afterlife. There's a conservation of observation law that maybe we'll find.
There you go. That's what I should have called it back then, you know. But you're going to keep making these decisions even after you're gone.
Yeah, your Wikipedia page says that you are a theist, and I think that's wonderful. I mean, I'm certainly a mystic, and I'm a scientist with a pretty open mind about what's possible, because I think it's important to listen to the witnesses that through all of history who have witnessed things, right? And they're telling us this is data. This is, you know, you can't just say, "No, I don't think it's true. I'm just going to ignore everything that anybody ever said about their."
Well,
their
this whole arrogance, this arrogance of, you know, people who believe in God are irrational. 97% of people believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to discount all of them. They may not be right in their theories about God, but then none of us may be. So I had an experience in 2000 of flying out to the FBI Academy. And on the airplane, I suddenly realized that I was being spoken to. I had a cold river feeling down the back of my head. And that went on for a month. And it was a contact with something that did not agree with being called God, but that I thought was certainly in that possibility. And that went on for 30 days. And, you know, that's longer than most of us have a chance to interact.
Wow.
And one of my favorite stories of this sort of thing is in one of the Encyclopedia Britannica volumes on Aquinas, where the afterword says that Aquinas, after writing all of these theological books, was giving a speech. And he suddenly stopped in the middle of the speech, looked out over them, and just kind of got a blank look on his face and walked back to his room. And one of the monks came to him and said later, "Well, what happened, sir?" And Aquinas says, "I have been afforded such knowledge as makes all my work so far wrong." And he says, "I can't explain beyond that." And so if what I experienced was what Aquinas experienced, what Aquinas had done was try to create an entire world system around God. And what God very lovingly perhaps had done was to tell him, "Nope, sorry, you got it wrong. Here's what's going on," and then touched his brain. And if that was what happened to me, I kind of pity poor Aquinas. Although he spent years afterwards perhaps trying to equate new mystical theories, he was definitely a theoretician and an amazing man and a very popular and friendly man. But what happened to him? You know, what happens to us when this happens to us? I spent 30 days on that, and it kind of gradually faded out. But how did that change me? Was I being, you know, like Harry Seldon giving me advice or whatever? Was this what was going on? I have no idea. But that certainly made it impossible for me. And I didn't believe in atheism before that, but that made it impossible for me to be an atheist.
Sorry, when I first came across Blood Music, this was many, many years ago, and I believe that I was searching for the keywords spiritual science, and this book came up. So is what you're talking about now, does it have, I mean, in the third book of Blood Music, the third story, death seems really beautiful or easy. I guess, what's the attachment to what you were just speaking about now? Do you think that there's...
I don't know. This was before, quite a ways before I had my experience, since it was started in the early 1990s. But, you know, I'm willing to keep an open mind. I don't have the answers, and I think I never have had the answers. And having these experiences does not give me necessarily any major answers. But in terms of afterlife and all that kind of stuff, I have no idea. I can't explain it, and I certainly can't explain it scientifically. I suspect that our science And I actually, Arthur C. Clarke was kind of writing about this when he wrote about, as far as ghosts go, he says, we may know what they are eventually. We don't know what they are now, but they may have a scientific basis. Possibly. I just don't know. The current science is probably 1,000 years, 2,000 years behind understanding these sorts of things, which brings me back to being, Isaac Asimov again. Isaac was an atheist. He did not believe any of this stuff. And yet he wrote science fiction. And science fiction, for people like Arthur C. Clarke, who's one of his good friends, science fiction is a kind of a thinking about things beyond what we understand today. And that is where we should all be, with humility and with patience and understanding, because a lot of people really have a hard time dealing with this and are really hopeful that they will live forever in the current form of their existence. That I don't think is going to happen. But what comes thereafter, I don't know.
Well, I think this network view of the world that you expressed here, and I mean, I think I've read you say we're a bunch of overlapping networks of different things, right? Our immune system is a network. Our
the immune system is a kind of brain,
it's a kind of brain, yeah. And our microbe, right? Our the microbial communities that live with us, are also another kind of network, and our brain is another kind of network. So, I think the circle that we draw that says this is myself, right, is kind of an artificial thing around very different components that are made of different stuff and interacting. So what if that circle, when you die, it gets drawn around yet a different, larger network, right? Like these
could be interesting, yeah.
Go up and down scale. Yeah. So maybe we're in the motions of the trees, or the grass.
Certainly sounds poetic, doesn't it?
Right. Well, thank you for reflecting on that.
My pleasure talking to you guys.
Yeah. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and talking to you, and we wish you all the best. Hopefully we can maybe talk to you again one day after your next project.
That sounds good. I'm working on a memoir now, so if it ever gets published, we can talk about that.
Oh, well, that's nice. Perfect. Great. We would love to read that and then have another chat.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, guys.
So much, Greg.
If you want to read more of Greg's work, go to gregbear.com. It's a great place to start. You're going to find the classics. You're going to find the new stuff. Go check out Greg's work. You won't be disappointed. Okay, next episode we are talking about the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. We hope you can join us. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time.